Products has been supplying the world's best knitting machines to home knitters for 35 years. During that time, we have established and maintained a reputation for supplying high-quality merchandise at competitive prices. Studio machines come from a manufacturer whose primary product is knitting machines. Studio is first with new technology. The world's first punch card machine came from Studio, as well as the world's first electronic machine. Studio's excellent warranty and service programs can give you years of happy and creative knitting. Studio Creative Knitting Machines. We'd like to introduce you to the Studio LK140 knitting machine, the perfect machine for the first-time knitter. Let's start with the basics. You've brought your new Studio LK140 home, so the first thing to do is unpack it. Take the lid from the box and put it upside down behind the machine. Take the styrofoam packing from the machine and place it in the lid. Take the machine from the box and put it to one side. We're going to use some of the accessories straight away, so we'll take those out now. Take out the clamps and fasten the machine to the front of the table. Lift the carriage handle until it clicks into place. Next, take the yarn rod, the auto tension, and the tension guide from the styrofoam and attach those to the machine. Put the yarn rod into the holder at the center of the machine. Then take the yarn guide and clip that onto the yarn rod, roughly halfway up the rod. Then take the springs of the auto tension, lift them up, and click them into place and set the auto tension on top of the yarn rod. Take the row counter from the styrofoam and click that into the holder at the center of the machine. Take the yarn rests and put them into the holders at either side of the needle bed. The other accessories we're going to need are the transfer tools, the latch tool, 2 small claw weights, 1 section of the cast-on comb, and the needle pusher that has 1 straight edge. We've finished with the box for the moment, so we can put that away now. Let's have a closer look at the needle bed and carriage. Studio's LK140 machine has 140 needles set into grooves. Each needle has a choice of 4 positions. The needle will behave differently according to the position you put it in. The positions are marked on both ends of the needle bed. Position A is a rest position. The needles don't do anything. Position B is the normal knitting position. Position C is where you push the needles after pattern knitting when you want to start knitting stocking stitch again. Position D is the holding position used for both tuck and slip stitch patterns and for short row or partial knitting. We'll look at the carriage now. The tension dial has a choice of 14 settings, so you can choose which is best for whatever type of yarn you're using. The numbers include an R setting for knitting ribs on a tight tension, and the other numbers go from 1 to 7 with a dot in between. Each setting knits at a different tension. 1 is the setting for the smallest stitch size. 7 is the setting for the largest stitch size. Turn the dial to match the stitch size to the pink triangle at the front. There are 2 sets of levers on the LK140 carriage, 1 set at the back and 1 set at the front. The back levers control the needles in B position. The rustle levers, or front levers, control the needles in D position. To start with, We want all the needles in every position to knit, so set the front levers forward and the back levers back. At the back of the carriage is the carriage release lever. You can use this at any time to release the carriage from the needle bed. At the front of the carriage are the yarn feeders. Feeder 1 is to the left of the black section, feeder 2 to the right of the black section. Feeder 2 is only used for plaiting, so for the moment we're just going to use yarn feeder 1. We're ready to start knitting now. The first thing to do is to thread some yarn into the machine. Choose a smooth worsted weight yarn to practice with. Use either a cone of yarn or a rewound ball of hand knitting yarn. Stand the cone on the table behind the machine underneath the yarn guide. Take the end of the yarn and thread it through the right-hand eye of the yarn guide. Pull the metal disc of the auto tension slightly to the right and take the yarn in between the white peg and the metal peg. Bring the yarn forward and thread it through the front of the auto tension and then through the eye of the auto spring. Make a slip knot in the end of the yarn and loop it over the right-hand clamp. Thread the yarn into feeder 1. That's the feeder just to the left hand of the black section. Now we're ready to cast on. Use the straight edge of the needle pusher to set 50 needles at the center of the machine to B position, the normal knitting position. The needle bed is marked 0 in the center, and the needles are marked in groups of 5. So push 25 needles on either side of 0 to B position. Turn the needle pusher over and use the other side to push every alternate needle back to A position. Take the carriage over the needles once to make loops of yarn on the needles in B position. Make sure the carriage clears the last needle. If the end needles are pushed slightly out of line, set them back to the correct position with your finger. Hook the cast-on comb into the loops of yarn. Using the needle pusher again, bring the empty needles from A position to B position. Take the carriage back across the needles, making sure you clear the end needle. And that completes the cast-on. Wasn't that simple? Now knit about 4 more rows and hook the claw weights at the edges just below the needles. We'll start with shaping. Increasing and decreasing is done with transfer tools. We're going to do a single stitch increase first, so take the single-ended transfer tool. To increase by 1 stitch, take the end stitch off its needle. Move it over 1 needle and replace it on the new needle 1 position away. Go back to the second stitch, pick up the heel of that stitch, and put it on the empty needle. To decrease a stitch, you do the same thing in reverse. Take the stitch off the last working needle. Put it onto the next adjacent needle and knit. You can also decrease a stitch at both ends at the same time. To increase more than 1 stitch, work at the carriage side of the knitting. Bring the number of needles you want to increase to D position. Wrap the yarn and wrap it around the empty needles. Take it under the first needle next to the knitting and back over the top. This is called the E-wrap cast-on. Repeat this for all the needles you want to increase. Always remember to do this on the carriage side of the knitting. Decreasing more than 1 stitch is done using the same technique as casting off. Again, you do this on the carriage side of the knitting. Take the end stitch off the needle and put it onto the next. Push the needle forward so both stitches go behind the latch. Lay the yarn in the hook of the needle and push the needle back to B position so the latch closes and both stitches slip over, leaving a new stitch in the needle hook. Repeat this for as many stitches as you want to decrease. This sample shows single stitch increasing and decreasing, and multiple stitch increasing and decreasing. Now we're going to do some short row or partial knitting using holding position. This technique is used for shoulder shaping, darts, and sideways knitted skirts. We'll change color so we can see the effect this has on the knitting. This time we work on the side opposite to where the carriage is. Bring 5 needles to holding position, which is D position. Now we only want to knit the B position needles, so we have to change the setting of the Russell levers. On both sides of the carriage, set the Russell levers to the back position. This will stop the D position needles from knitting, but we'll still knit the B position needles. Knit 1 row and take the yarn under the first needle in D position and over the remaining needles. Taking the yarn under the first needle in D position will prevent a hole from forming in the knitting. Knit a second row. Repeat this process as many times as you need, always bringing needles to the holding position on the side opposite the carriage. Change back to the first color of yarn. Now we want to bring all the needles in the holding position back into B position. So to do this, set the Russell levers on the carriage to the forward position. You can see the partial knitting has caused the fabric to grow longer on one side of the machine. This finished sample shows how you can also use this technique to create special effects in the fabric. Tuck patterns are made by some of the needles knitting, while others hold loops of yarn which are all knitted off together. The colored needle rollers on Studio's LK140 machine can help you decide which needles to make a pattern on. Each group of 5 needles has different color rollers. For this pattern, we're going to bring the first needle of each group into D position. These are the needles that will hold the loops of yarn, while the B position needles knit normally. We need to set the levers on the machine to knit only the B position needles and leave the D position needles to make the pattern. The Russell levers at the front of the carriage are both set to the 1 or back position. Knit several rows with the needles in this position. Then set the Russell levers to the 2 or front position to knit the D position needles in stocking stitch. For the next pattern sequence, bring the second needle in the color group to the D position and repeat the same technique. Set the Russell lever on the carriage to the 1 position so they won't knit the D position needles. Again, knit a few rows with this needle arrangement, then return the Russell levers to the 2 setting to knit the D position needles. This sample shows a completed piece of tuck stitch. Either side of this fabric can be used as the right side. You can use as many different colors of yarn as you like. Now we're going to do some slip stitch. This time, needles in B position won't knit, but the needles in D position will. We need to change the setting on the side levers. To make the D position needles knit, the Russell levers come forward to the 2 setting. To make the B position needles slip, the side levers come forward to the spot setting. Set the needles that you want to knit to the D position. As the carriage moves across the needles, D position needles are knitted back to B, and the B position needles remain where they were, leaving the loops which form the slip stitch pattern. Bring needles to D position for every pattern row. 2-color slip stitch is made in the same way, changing yarns every 2 rows. This is also used to make Fair Isle patterns. Next comes weaving, which is how you can incorporate a thick yarn into the fabric without knitting it. Use the needle pusher to bring all the needles to D position. Take the thicker yarn, starting from the same side of the knitting as the carriage is. Lay it over 1 and under 4 all the way across the needles. Make sure the rustle levers on both sides of the carriage are set to 2. The side levers are set to the triangle position, and the main yarn is still in feeder 1. Knit 1 row. Repeat the same technique on every pattern row. All the needles come to D position, and the yarn is laid over and under the needles. This sample has been knitted in weaving. You can see that the thicker yarn only lies on the surface of the purl side of the fabric, so the plain side of the fabric is main color stockinette. Now we come to plaiting. This uses 2 fine yarns which knit together. Thread the yarn from the right-hand side of the auto tension into feeder 2 and the left-hand yarn into feeder 1. Set the stitch tension dial to the number required for each yarn added together. One color is dominant on each side of the fabric. You can also make garter stitch on Studio's LK140 machine. Knit 2 rows of stocking stitch. Take the latch tool and open it. Put it into the stitch below the stitch that's on the needle. With your finger, bring the needle forward to D position and return it to B position so the stitch comes off the needle. Undo the stitch and then pick up the loose yarn into the hook of the latch tool. Slip the stitch behind the latch, leaving the loop in front. Pull the latch tool towards you, closing the latch and slipping the stitch off. Replace the newly formed stitch onto the empty needle. This technique is also used to make rib stitches and to make cables stand out. Cables can be made over 2, 4, or 6 stitches. We're going to use 2 triple-ended transfer tools to make a 6-stitch cable. Select the cable needles first. We're using the colored roller bearings as a guide, so use 3 pink and 3 gray needles. Push these needles very slightly forward to mark the position of them. Drop 1 stitch on each side of these needles by pushing the needle out to D position and back to B. Using the transfer tools, take the stitches off the cable needles. Replace the right-hand stitches on the left-hand needles and the left-hand stitches on the right-hand needles. Continue to knit until you're ready to cable again. Then repeat the whole process. Drop 1 stitch either side of the cable needles and then cable 6 stitches. When you finish the piece, pick up the dropped stitches using the latch tool. Work from the front of the knitting as you did for garter stitch and pick up each loop of yarn. When you reach the top, place this newly formed plain stitch in the empty needle. This sample shows how effective the combination of garter stitch and cables can be. Like all the stitch patterns on Studio's LK140, you have control over exactly where the pattern is going to be, so you can mix any combination of stitches. The next stitch pattern we're going to see is transfer lace. This also uses transfer tools. Take 1 stitch off its needle and move it over 1 place. There are now 2 stitches on this needle with an empty needle next to it. Leave the empty needle in B position. When you're knitting lace patterns, transfer stitches to both right and left. If you transfer in one direction only, the fabric will develop a bias. This lace pattern would look very pretty on the front of a sweater and also uses garter stitch to edge the lace panel. We've looked at all the stitch patterns that your Studio LK140 will knit now. Before we see how to knit garment shapes, we'll have a look at some of the garments knitted on this machine. The KR10 Knit Contour is available as an accessory for Studio's LK140 machine. It's from a visual garment shaping system, so you can knit any type of yarn, any stitch pattern, and any garment shape that you want. The Knit Contour is battery operated, so insert the batteries is shown on page 6 of the operation book. Plug the Knit Contour into the machine. Knit and measure the tension swatch following the instructions on page 25 of the knitting machine instruction book. Next, take the knitting pattern for the garment that you want to knit. 4 patterns come with the Knit Contour. For this example, we're going to use sheet 1, the ladies' pullover, which is drawn in half scale. We're going to knit the largest size, which is size F. Take one of the half-scale blank plastic sheets and lay that over the diagram. Trace the largest size off onto the plastic sheet. Next, we're going to set the stitch and row information that we got from the tension swatch into the Knit Contour. Set the switch on the right-hand side of the Knit Contour to the off position. Next, set the select lever on the left-hand side of the Knit Contour to half or quarter scale. The ladies' pullover is a half-scale pattern, so set the lever to half. The select lever can only be changed when the Knit Contour is off. Now select the stitch scale with the number equal to that measured on the tension swatch. Our tension swatch had 20 stitches to 4 inches of knitting, so select the half-scale knitting scale with 20 in the top left-hand corner. Place that into the clips in the front of the Knit Contour. Lift the paper stand at the back of the Knit Contour towards you. Feed the pattern paper into the slot behind the stitch scale and in front of the paper stand. Turn the feeding dial slowly towards you, ensuring that the horizontal lines on the pattern paper are parallel to the stitch scale. Turn the feeding dial until the beginning of the pattern is lined up with the top of the stitch scale. Make sure that the edge of your pattern paper is lined up with the 0 at the left-hand side of the stitch scale. Switch the Knit Contour on and the display shows 0. Press the Set key once and the display now shows a garment shape on the left-hand side and 0.0 on the right-hand side. Now press the plus key and the display shows 10.0. To set the required row gauge, press the plus key. If you go over the number that you want, use the minus key to return to the correct figure. Our tension swatch measured 30 rows to 4 inches, so set 30 in the display panel. Press the Set key once again, and the display now shows 0. The row gauge is now memorized. After you set the gauge, the pattern should only be moved with the plus or minus key. To change the row gauge, you must switch the Knit Contour off and reprogram. So read the number of stitches required for the cast-on by looking at where the vertical line on the pattern crosses the horizontal line on the stitch scale. This particular pattern is 52 stitches, so cast on 52 stitches on either side of center 0 to make a complete garment shape. If the vertical contour line comes between 2 lines on the knitting scale, always read the highest number. You're now ready to cast on and start knitting. Knit up to the armhole shaping, following the contour line. Every time the carriage is moved across the needle bed, the pattern paper and row counter are automatically moved on by 1 row. Stop knitting once you reach the armhole shaping and check where the knit contour crosses the stitch scale, and that shows you how many stitches to decrease. Continue knitting, decreasing where necessary until you reach the shoulder shaping. Start to decrease on both sides of the machine using either holding position or casting stitches off. Continue with the shoulder shaping until you reach the neckline. Cast off the center stitches for the neckline shaping. Continue to work on half of the garment, shaping the shoulder and the neckline until you reach the top. For the second half of the neckline, press the minus key to return the pattern paper to the beginning of the neckline shaping. Knit the second part of the neckline and shoulder, decreasing where necessary, until again you reach the top. Press the minus key to return the pattern paper to the starting line. The pattern paper stops automatically when the row counter reaches 0. If you want to lock the pattern into the knit contour, press the pause key and the display will disappear. You might want to do this to do waist knitting for a pocket opening partway through the work. Press the pause key again, and the display will show the number of rows knitted, and the knit contour will continue to move. If you need to unravel some knitting, press the minus key to turn back the pattern paper. Press once for each new row unraveled. The number of rows shown on the digital display is reduced, and the pattern paper is fed backwards. If you want to stop knitting for a while, unplug the knit contour and the machine. The row gauge and the number of rows knitted are still memorized. If you want to reprogram the knit contour with a different row gauge, turn the knit contour off using the on-off switch on the right-hand side. Another accessory that's available for Studio's LK140 machine is the AG10 Intarsia Carriage. This carriage allows you to knit as many different colors in one row as you want. It replaces the main carriage on the machine and works with the needles in C position. All the needle latches are open, and the yarn is laid into the needle hooks on every single needle. As the carriage travels across the needles, the stitches are knitted in and returned to C position again, ready to collect the next color of yarn. Now we've covered all the basic techniques you'll need to know to get you started on a lifetime of happy knitting on your Studio LK140. A lot of the principles are the same for other Studio models, so if at any time you want to upgrade your machine, you'll find that much of the knowledge you've just acquired is relevant. Remember, we're always here if you get stuck. Studio Products Creative Knitting Machines.